Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves standing on a ridge overlooking what used to be Atlanta, Georgia. It's November 1864, and the night sky glows a deep orange from 1,000 small fires licking at the bones of a broken city. The air tastes of soot and wet wood. You can hear the slow, rhythmic pop of collapsing rafters, the echo of metal clanging as soldiers pry up rails. Somewhere in that glow, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman watches silently, arms crossed, expression unreadable, as another warehouse gives in to the flames. You, standing beside him, can almost feel the heat prickle your face. It's hauntingly beautiful and terrifying at once. You probably wouldn't survive this one, not just because of the danger, but because of the sheer exhaustion that clings to every man here after 4 long years of civil war. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, drop your location and local time in the comments below. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The siege of Atlanta had been costly beyond imagination. For weeks, Union and Confederate forces fought street to street, cannon to cannon, in a brutal contest that left the city gasping. When Sherman finally took Atlanta in early September, he didn't celebrate with parades or speeches. Instead, he sat down to write his official report with a kind of grim practicality. Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. He knew victory here wasn't an end, it was a doorway. Beyond it lay the heart of the Confederacy, still beating defiantly in Georgia's red clay soil. The city around him is hardly a city anymore. Roofs have caved in from artillery fire. Telegraph poles lean like broken ribs. The railroad depot, once the pulsing artery of the Confederate war effort, lies in splinters. You step over fragments of wagon wheels, a child's shoe, and the twisted iron of a locomotive that had been packed with ammunition and set ablaze by retreating Confederates. The explosion was so fierce it shattered windows miles away. The stench of burnt grain still clings to the air. For Sherman, none of this destruction feels like cruelty. In his mind, it's arithmetic. Simple, ruthless arithmetic. Destroy the South's ability to fight and the war ends sooner. Spare the people's feelings and it might drag on for years. War, he will later write, is cruelty and you cannot refine it. But at this moment, standing amid the embers, you sense even he feels the weight of what's coming. Outside Atlanta, the Union camps buzz with rumor. Some soldiers think they'll stay put for the winter. Others whisper about marching all the way to the Atlantic coast, cutting the Confederacy clean in two. The idea seems insane. Between here and Savannah lies 225 miles of enemy territory. Rivers and swamps, guerrillas, and towns fiercely loyal to the Confederate cause. No reliable supply lines, no reinforcements, just 62,000 men, a few thousand cavalry, and sheer nerve. Yet Sherman is already drawing lines on his map. He looks eastward and sees opportunity. If he can slice through Georgia, he can destroy the South's remaining infrastructure, its rails, mills, and morale. He can unhinge Confederate logistics and make them feel the war in their own homes. And maybe, just maybe, he can force Robert E. Lee in Virginia to pull troops away from Grant, ending the stalemate that has bled both sides dry. It's easy to forget how uncertain everything feels right now. The war's in its 4th year, and the North is tired. Every casualty list printed in Northern newspapers gnaws at public patience. Ulysses S. Grant is locked in a horrific slugfest against Lee around Petersburg. Even victories feel hollow when they cost thousands of lives. In November, the United States will hold a presidential election, and President Abraham Lincoln fears he may lose it. Without military success, peace Democrats in the North are ready to sue for an armistice, a polite word for surrender. Then came Atlanta. When the telegraph clicked out the news that the city had fallen, the nation seemed to exhale for the first time in months. Lincoln's campaign banners, once drooping in gloom, sprang up again. The Republican presses declared the victory proof that divine providence favored the Union cause. "Atlanta is ours," read headlines from Chicago to New York, "and so shall be the Union." Lincoln's re-election suddenly felt possible, and the soldiers in the field sensed their sacrifices might not be in vain. That's the political backdrop behind the flickering firelight. Sherman isn't just commanding an army, he's carrying the hopes of a divided nation. And he knows it. When he writes to Grant, he doesn't waste time with flowery rhetoric. Instead, he lays out a plan with a surgeon's cold precision. He will abandon his supply line from Chattanooga, march his men straight through Georgia, wreck every railroad and depot in his path, and capture Savannah. "I can make the march," he writes, "and make Georgia howl." Historians still debate whether Grant hesitated. After all, sending tens of thousands of men deep into enemy territory without supply lines was unheard of in modern warfare. It broke every rule in the West Point Manual. But Grant, ever pragmatic, saw the potential. If Sherman succeeded, it would cripple Confederate mobility, cut off Lee, and demonstrate that the South could no longer defend its own heartland. Lincoln, upon hearing the plan, simply said, "Go as you propose." There's a small, almost forgotten moment in Sherman's headquarters when the final orders are read out. Officers glance at one another, half in disbelief. Some quietly sharpen their swords. Others make jokes to hide their nerves. One officer, Colonel Adelbert Ames, supposedly muttered, "Well, boys, we're going to tear the map of Dixie in half." A curious image. An army literally erasing geography. As night deepens, the campfires outside Atlanta flicker in neat rows. You can hear harmonicas playing faintly through the smoke. Soldiers roast corn stolen from nearby fields, share tobacco, or write letters home that start with "Dear Mother" and end with "Your loving son, if God wills." One private sketches a cartoon in his journal, Sherman riding a rail like a witch on a broomstick, Georgia spread below him. The caption reads, "To Savannah, and the devil take the hindmost." There's levity, but there's fear too. Everyone knows they're about to step into the unknown. They will have no resupply, no fallback position. If Confederate forces cut them off, they could starve. One quartermaster jokes that their next Thanksgiving turkey might be stolen from a Georgian farmstead. Another replies, "If the Rebs don't shoot us first." By November 11th, the men begin tearing up Atlanta's remaining rail lines. The screech of crowbars on iron echoes through the ruins. They heat rails until they glow, twist them around trees into grotesque spirals. Sherman's neckties, someone calls them, a name that will stick in infamy. By the 15th, the city is stripped of anything useful. Depots, machine shops, foundries, all wrecked beyond repair. Sherman walks through the smoldering heart of the city one last time. Civilians watch from porches, some weeping, others cursing him. He removes his hat briefly, murmuring to his aide, This is war." At dawn on November 16th, the bugles sound. The columns begin to move east, 4 abreast, banners fluttering against the pale morning sky. As the last wagons roll out, a final blast of fire blooms behind them. The army has set the industrial quarter ablaze, deliberately, methodically. The heat rises like a storm. A woman in morning black stands at her gate, clutching a scorched Bible, whispering, "May God forgive you." Sherman doesn't turn. His horse steps over a blackened plank, and the march begins. From a distance, the smoke forms a dark pillar visible for miles, a grim lighthouse guiding them toward the sea. You, watching from the rear guard, can't help but feel a shiver. Whatever this is, it's more than a campaign. It's the transformation of war itself, an experiment in fear, movement, and willpower. And though the night smells of ashes, something in you suspects this is only the beginning. The morning air carries a crisp bite as you move east with Sherman's army, boots crunching frost over churned red clay. Behind you, the smoldering wreck of Atlanta recedes. its skyline now just a haze of smoke and ash. The men joke grimly that if the devil himself ever wanted a new capital, Atlanta's ready. You smile, but the sound of distant explosions reminds you this war is far from done. While the soldiers march, the telegraphs sing. Word of Atlanta's fall streaks northward like lightning through copper wires. Within days, headlines splash across every northern newspaper. Sherman takes Atlanta. Victory in Georgia. Crowds gather in city squares from Boston to Chicago, waving flags, singing, battle cry of freedom. Even brokers on Wall Street pause their shouting long enough to cheer. For the first time in months, hope feels like more than a rumor. You might not realize how close the Union came to collapse before this. By the summer of 1864, Lincoln's approval ratings had cratered. Families were sick of sending sons to die in Virginia mud. Newspapers like the New York World whispered that peace, even if it meant Confederate independence, might be better than endless bloodshed. Confederate agents in Canada even planned arson attacks to fan anti-war sentiment in northern cities. Then Sherman took Atlanta, and everything changed. Lincoln's re-election campaign, once gasping for air, suddenly caught fire. On the night of September 3rd, a torchlight parade wound through Washington, D.C. Thousands of citizens chanted the general's name. Lincoln watched from the White House balcony, his tired face lit by flames and fireworks. "Sherman has given us a victory," he murmured. And with it, perhaps the Union itself. Back in Georgia, Sherman isn't thinking about politics, though he's well aware of the stakes. His letters to Grant and Lincoln read like strategic manifestos rather than battlefield reports. He argues that occupying cities isn't enough. We must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. It sounds merciless, but his logic is coldly mathematical. Crush the Confederacy's will to resist, and fewer lives will ultimately be lost. Historians still debate whether Sherman's reasoning reflects compassion or calculated terror. Grant, in Virginia, reads Sherman's proposal with a long drag from his cigar. The two men share a rare military chemistry, mutual respect forged in blood and attrition. Grant knows that if anyone can carve through the South and survive without supply lines, it's the grim-faced general from Ohio. He telegraphs a terse reply. Go as you propose. No elaborate planning committee, no congressional debate, just two men gambling the fate of the Union on a march through enemy heartland. You glance over the formation spreading across the Georgia countryside. The Army of the Tennessee, under Oliver O. Howard on one wing, the Army of Georgia, under Henry Slocum on the other. Between them, artillery rattles on wooden wheels. Cavalry scouts fan out ahead. It's less an army now and more a moving city of men. Wagon trains, blacksmith forges, medical tents, even mobile printing presses. Somewhere among them, regimental bands play John Brown's Body, the tune carrying faintly over the fields. By mid-November, Sherman orders every remaining rail out of Atlanta torn up. The soldiers heat the iron bars over bonfires and twist them around tree trunks into corkscrew shapes. A corporal jokes that the twisted rails look like Yankee pretzels. Another quips, well, the Rebs can't unbake 'em. These, Sherman's neckties, as they'll later be called, symbolize more than destruction. They represent a deliberate unmaking of Confederate modernity. No trains mean no armies. No armies mean no rebellion. But not everyone in blue approves. Some officers worry the general's strategy crosses moral lines. Colonel Charles Ewing confides in his diary that the orders smell of vengeance. Others recall Sherman pacing his tent at night, muttering that the South must be made to feel the war. It's hard to tell whether he's convincing himself or his staff. Meanwhile, the Confederacy reels. President Jefferson Davis in Richmond denounces Sherman's plan as barbarous and vows to stop him. He dispatches John Bell Hood's battered army northward toward Tennessee, hoping to lure Sherman into pursuit. But Sherman doesn't bite. "Hood can march to the Ohio for all I care," he tells Grant. "My business is down in Georgia." The decision stuns Confederate strategists. They expected him to chase Hood. Instead, he leaves the rebel general behind and plunges into the Deep South. On November 11th, Union engineers begin destroying what's left of the city's rail yard. The clang of hammers rings day and night. The air grows thick with the smell of tar, smoke, and scorched pine. By the 15th, the last locomotive is gone, reduced to molten slag. Sherman rides through the ruins inspecting the work. "That will do," he says quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. The next morning, as dawn light filters through smoke, the order comes. March. 62,000 infantrymen, 5,000 cavalry, and 64 cannons roll forward in two great columns, banners snapping in the cold wind. The earth trembles under the synchronized tramp of boots. Civilians watch from porches and churchyards, silent. A few wave white handkerchiefs, unsure whether to mourn or surrender. One child shouts, "Where are you going, mister?" A soldier grins. "To the sea, son, straight to the sea." Behind them, the fires begin. Sherman's engineers ignite warehouses, machine shops, and ammunition stores. Flames race along rooftops, leap from beam to beam. Even with strict orders to spare private homes and churches, the inferno spreads uncontrollably. Wind gusts scatter embers like fiery confetti, setting entire blocks ablaze. By evening, the sky glows red enough to read by. You turn once more to look back. The scene resembles some medieval vision of hell. Atlanta, engulfed. Soldiers move like shadows against the firelight. The crackle of burning timber merges with the distant bugle calls. A mule brays in panic as its harness catches flame. Somewhere, a band plays Marching Through Georgia, though the tune hasn't officially been written yet. Irony has impeccable timing. By the time the last brigade clears the outskirts, nearly 40% of the city lies in ruins. Sherman later insists he ordered only the destruction of military property, yet contemporary witnesses tell another story. Sparks jumped to residential districts, and drunken soldiers joined the blaze. Historians still argue whether the burning of Atlanta was deliberate policy or uncontrollable chaos. Either way, it becomes one of the most haunting images of the entire war. For the civilians left behind, the aftermath is apocalyptic. Families pick through rubble searching for unburned food. Mothers carry water from wells that taste faintly of ash. A Union surgeon who revisits the city weeks later writes that Atlanta looks like Pompeii after the lava cooled. Sherman's army, meanwhile, snakes southeast across Georgia. Each corps moves on a different road to stretch Confederate defenses thin. Scouts ride ahead to locate crossings over the Ocmulgee and Oconee rivers. Cavalry under Judson Kilpatrick dart through villages, tearing down telegraph wires, capturing stray supply wagons. The rhythm of the march settles in, 15 miles a day, sometimes more. At night, campfires bloom like a constellation across the countryside. To an observer, it might almost look peaceful. The steady roll of drums, the low hum of men singing by the fires. But beneath the surface lies something revolutionary. For the first time in modern warfare, an army this large is operating completely without a supply line, feeding itself off the land. It's a logistical gamble so audacious that even foreign military attachés later study it as a model of psychological warfare. As you trudge beside the column, you overhear one private joke that he's finally getting to see the world, though so far it's mostly mud and burned fences. Another soldier, scraping soot off his musket, mutters, "We'll make Georgia remember us." A third adds, "They'll remember all right when they got no chickens left." The men laugh, but the laughter trails off into silence. Somewhere in that silence, you sense the enormity of what's begun. When night falls, Sherman rides ahead to inspect the lead divisions. His face is lit by lantern light, his blue coat flecked with cinders. "We're not just fighting armies," he tells an aide. "We're fighting the spirit of rebellion itself." Whether you agree with him or not, one thing is clear. The March to the Sea isn't just a campaign. It's a statement, a grim sermon delivered on the altar of war. And tonight, with the embers of Atlanta still glowing behind you, the sermon has only just begun. The road stretches ahead like a scar across the Georgia countryside, muddy, rutted, and echoing with the endless rhythm of marching boots. You can almost feel the vibration of 60,000 feet through the soles of your shoes. Each step takes you farther from the safety of supply lines and deeper into the uncertain heart of the Confederacy. The men joke about it, of course. Soldiers always do. One private calls this Sherman's picnic. Another dubs it the Trail of Fire. But no one really knows how this will end, not even Sherman himself. After leaving Atlanta, the Union Army splinters into 4 parallel columns, each spaced miles apart. The plan is simple but brilliant, spread out wide enough to confuse Confederate scouts and make it impossible for any single force to stop them. If one wing is attacked, the others can close in from different roads like the jaws of a trap. "We move like the fingers of a hand," Sherman tells his officers, "separate but always closing into a fist." You march alongside the left wing under Major General Henry Slocum, who takes the route through Decatur and Covington. The right wing, led by Oliver O. Howard, pushes south through Jonesboro and McDonough. Cavalry under the flamboyant Judson Kilpatrick ride ahead like a restless tide, probing for resistance. The organization feels almost modern, a mobile army designed for speed, not siege. The countryside reacts like a body under invasion. Some towns raise white flags, hoping to avoid destruction. Others fortify crossroads with whatever they can find: logs, wagons, even overturned furniture. Confederate cavalry commander Joseph Wheeler, a wiry and relentless figure, shadows Sherman's advance. His men strike quickly and vanish into the woods, ambushing foragers, sniping at scouts, and spreading rumors of massive rebel reinforcements that don't actually exist. It's psychological warfare in miniature. Meanwhile, Sherman issues a new order: live off the land. No more wagons loaded with northern flour or salted beef. Instead, each regiment forms foraging parties, nicknamed bummers, who fan out daily to seize food, livestock, and fodder from nearby farms. They're supposed to leave enough for families to survive and avoid unnecessary cruelty. But orders on paper rarely match reality in the field. By the end of the first week, tales of plunder are everywhere. Soldiers trade stolen hams and chickens for tobacco. They raid barns for corn and molasses, sometimes even silk dresses that end up draped over pack mules as a joke. A drummer boy writes in his diary, "We took everything but the baby, and I reckon he crawled off." The humor masks the ugliness. In truth, desperation and opportunity blur together. Some men steal out of hunger, others simply out of spite. A quirky fact surfaces among the wreckage. A few regiments take to calling their foraging wagons Uncle Billy's Commissary, a nod to Sherman's nickname, Uncle Billy. Soldiers claim their general smiles on all this improvisation. Sherman himself later writes that his army foraged liberally on the country. That's one way to put it. As the blue columns move east, terrified families hide what they can. Women bury silverware and jewelry in their gardens, sometimes under chicken coops or beneath rose bushes. Slaves, uncertain of what freedom means, often whisper secrets to Union foragers: where their masters hid food, which barns contain livestock, where whiskey barrels are buried. Some slaves even guide soldiers through unfamiliar back roads in exchange for protection. Historians still debate whether Sherman's men represented liberators or invaders. In many places, they were both. Freedmen followed the columns in growing numbers, forming contraband camps along the route. Children ran beside the soldiers shouting, "Bress de Lord, de Yankees come!" While behind them, Confederate partisans hissed, devils in blue. You begin to notice how fast the mood of the march shifts. 1 hour, laughter over a found piano dragged into camp. The next, grim silence as the men pass a burned farmhouse, still smoking. The contrast feels almost schizophrenic, a war oscillating between carnival and catastrophe. In a field near Madison, a Union regiment halts to rest. Someone discovers a barrel of molasses left behind by fleeing Confederates. Within minutes, it becomes a sticky free-for-all. Men scoop handfuls of the syrup, smear it on hardtack, even trade spoonfuls for cigars. When Sherman rides by, he barely glances at the spectacle, muttering, "If they eat, they march." That's all that matters. The pace quickens. 15 miles a day turns to 20, sometimes more. Along the route, soldiers systematically destroy the South's lifelines. Depots, mills, bridges, railways. They heat rails red hot and twist them around trees. Sherman's hairpins, one officer jokes, to keep Georgia tidy. It's destruction as performance art, each act designed to send a message. The Confederacy can no longer protect its own soil. At night, the campfires flicker across the hills like constellations. The men sing rough versions of Rally Round the Flag and We're Coming, Father Abraham. One group even composes a parody song titled Marching Through Georgia before the real one exists, half humor, half prophecy. You can almost hear the rhythm of it blending with the crackle of kindling. Sherman rides along the lines at dusk, his figure silhouetted against the sky. He's calm, detached, always scribbling notes in a small leather book. When one aide complains about the endless destruction, he replies quietly, "We are not fighting women and children, but the power that feeds their delusion. Burn the railroads, and you burn the rebellion." The logic is brutal but consistent. By mid-November, the army reaches the Ocmulgee River. Confederate resistance is sporadic at best. Wheeler's cavalry strikes, then vanishes into pine forests. A small skirmish erupts near Griswoldville, where local militia, many of them old men and boys, try to block the Union advance. The result is a massacre. Poorly armed Georgians charge headlong into veteran Union infantry, and within minutes the ground is littered with bodies. Sherman later writes that he regretted the useless waste of life, though he never pauses the march. That's the thing about this campaign. It's as psychological as it is physical. Sherman knows every destroyed bridge and burned depot isn't just a logistical blow, it's a symbol. Each column of smoke rising in the distance tells civilians and soldiers alike that the Confederacy is unraveling from within. "We are not only fighting armies," he tells a correspondent, "but a hostile people, and must make them dread us." Still, doubts linger, even among his own men. Some chaplains question the morality of torching barns and mills. A lieutenant from Iowa confides in a letter home that the line between victory and vengeance grows faint beneath the smoke. Historians still argue whether Sherman's campaign truly qualifies as total war. Did he invent a new kind of modern conflict, targeting civilian infrastructure as a weapon? Or was it simply a harsher extension of existing tactics? One evening, as the column halts near Eatonton, rain begins to fall. Thick, cold sheets that soak through uniforms and hiss against campfires. The men huddle under makeshift tents, steam rising from their clothes. Someone jokes that Georgia's crying for mercy. You look around and see faces glistening in the lantern light, tired, hollow, but determined. A mule brays and someone shouts, "Quiet down, Reb Mule, we're not done yet." Laughter ripples through the camp, momentary and fragile. In that moment, you realize how far you've come. Atlanta feels like a distant world now, a burnt dream fading behind you. Ahead lies more of Georgia, fields, swamps, rivers, and somewhere beyond, the glittering promise of the Atlantic. The men don't yet know what awaits them in Savannah, or the dark legend their march will become. They only know that they're part of something enormous and irreversible, a human storm rolling toward the sea. And as you drift to sleep beneath the drumming rain, the faint smell of smoke and molasses still clings to your clothes, a reminder that every step forward leaves something burning behind. By the time the sun rises on November 20th, the landscape has begun to change. The red clay gives way to rolling pine forests, the smell of resin thick in the morning air. The roads, if they can still be called roads, twist and crumble beneath the wagon wheels. Each mile forward feels like dragging civilization through wilderness. And yet, somehow, morale remains strangely high. The men sing, trade jokes, and claim they can smell the ocean already, though Savannah still lies more than 100 miles away. The army moves like a living organism now, its rhythms instinctive. Reveille sounds before dawn, and by first light, the blue columns are already on the march. Cavalry scouts push ahead, foragers fan out to either side, and the wagons creak behind like the spine of some enormous beast. If you stand still long enough, the sound becomes hypnotic. The shuffle of boots, the jingle of harness chains, the distant thump of artillery wheels over roots. It's the sound of momentum, of a nation grinding forward through exhaustion. For Sherman, this march isn't just military, it's psychological theater. He writes in his field diary that he wants to demonstrate to the South that we can march an army right through their heartland, and they cannot prevent it. Each mile conquered is a blow not only to Confederate logistics, but to Confederate pride. He wants them to see the smoke from their burning depots, to hear the bugles in their own backyards, to understand that the rebellion's protection is an illusion. Still, not every Georgian greets the Union columns with hatred. In fact, the reactions vary wildly. You pass one farmhouse where an old man leans on his fence post, staring as the soldiers trudge by. "You'll find nothing here," he mutters. A mile later, a group of enslaved people wave from a nearby field, shouting prayers and singing hymns of freedom. For them, the blue uniforms mean salvation, or at least the possibility of it. Sherman's men know how to use that enthusiasm. Every freed man or woman who joins the column carries intelligence: where the Confederates are hiding, which bridges are trapped, which plantations store hidden supplies. These contrabands, as they're called in the military paperwork, quickly become indispensable guides. Some even join as teamsters, cooks, or pioneers, earning army rations and a measure of safety, at least for now. But with every mile eastward, the army's appetite grows. Foraging parties scour the countryside, returning with wagons full of bacon, sweet potatoes, cornmeal, and chickens. They also bring back rumors, some wild, some terrifying. A forager swears he saw Wheeler's cavalry only 5 miles south. Another claims Confederate sharpshooters are shadowing the rear guard. Sherman listens but rarely reacts. His calm unnerves even his own officers. He simply tells them, "Keep moving. If we move fast enough, they can't hit us hard." At times, the destruction feels almost ritualistic. The engineers move through towns with methodical precision, torching depots and tearing up rails. The soldiers have turned the art of sabotage into sport. They lay iron rails over bonfires until the metal glows cherry red, then twist them around trees or telegraph poles. "Another necktie for Georgia," someone shouts. When the fire burns low, they march on, leaving the warped tracks gleaming like molten snakes in the dawn. Yet amidst the destruction, moments of strange tenderness still appear. Near Monticello, you watch a young private stop beside a ruined garden. A single rose bush, somehow untouched, stands there, in bloom. He plucks one flower and tucks it into his jacket pocket, whispering, "For home." Then he shoulders his musket and moves on. You realize that even in this landscape of ruin, traces of humanity survive. Fragile, fleeting, but real. Sherman rides near the front, his horse splashing through puddles left by last night's rain. He wears his trademark slouch hat pulled low, his face impassive. A correspondent from Harper's Weekly traveling with the army describes him as a man possessed of an iron logic, yet eyes that seem haunted by every fire he orders. Sherman later admits in a letter that each torch weighs on him, but he insists it's necessary. "We are not only fighting hostile armies," he writes, "but a hostile people. The quicker their power is broken, the sooner we can have peace. Historians still debate whether Sherman's hard war philosophy was born of cold strategy or frustration. Was he pioneering a form of total warfare, or simply reflecting the brutal arithmetic of a conflict that refused to end? The question lingers like smoke over every town the army passes through. By November 23rd, the left wing under Slocum approaches Milledgeville, the capital of Georgia. Confederate Governor Joseph Brown has already fled, taking what records he can carry. The militia garrison is small, mostly older men and boys, and quickly disperses when Union skirmishers appear at the outskirts. That evening, Sherman's troops march into the city unopposed. You expect solemnity, maybe even restraint. Instead, the scene turns almost surreal. Soldiers march straight to the State House and, by candlelight, stage a mock legislative session. They bang gavels, pass fake bills, and one officer stands on the speaker's platform to announce, "The state of Georgia hereby repeals her ordinance of secession." The men roar with laughter, some banging their muskets on the floor in applause. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The capital of rebellion has been symbolically dragged back into the Union by its invaders. But the humor fades quickly when the fires begin. Outside the State House, warehouses of cotton are torched, the flames spreading faster than anyone expects. A gust of wind sends sparks onto nearby rooftops. By midnight, half the city glows red. Sherman orders churches and private homes spared, but chaos blurs those lines. A few regiments, drunk on captured whiskey, go rogue, pillaging shops, smashing windows, looting anything that can be carried. One correspondent later writes, "Milledgeville burned not from orders, but from fury." In the morning, smoke hangs low over the streets like a funeral shroud. Sherman rides through the devastation, expression unreadable. He halts before a smoldering warehouse and turns to his aides. "We can rebuild cities," he says softly, "but not nations built on lies." Then, spurring his horse, he adds, "Forward." One curious incident becomes army folklore. Near Milledgeville, Sherman's men find a large riverboat stranded in the shallows of the Oconee River. They drag it ashore, load it with confiscated corn and bacon, and christen it the Hardtack Queen. Soldiers pull it along the riverbanks with ropes as if leading some enormous wooden mule. When it finally sinks 2 days later, no one mourns. It's just one more ghost added to Georgia's growing graveyard. From here, the march accelerates. Sherman wants to reach the coast before Confederate reinforcements can concentrate against him. But geography turns against the army. Swamps and streams crisscross the land, forcing the engineers to build endless pontoon bridges. Wagons bog down axle deep in mud. Mules die in harness. The men curse, sweat, and push on. Still, the army's discipline holds. Mostly. For every farm that's burned in anger, another is left untouched by soldiers who give children food or spare a widow's only cow. The contradictions pile up like kindling, mercy and cruelty, liberation and terror, all marching side by side. At night, you sit by a campfire and listen to the rain tapping your tent canvas. Someone nearby hums a hymn, low and tired. In the distance, lightning flashes, briefly illuminating the horizon. It looks almost like the glow of another burning town. You close your eyes, unsure whether you're witnessing the end of a rebellion or the birth of something entirely new. Sherman doesn't see it in those terms. To him, history isn't poetry, it's logistics. He measures progress not in emotion but in miles covered, rails twisted, bridges burned. And tonight, as he studies his map by lantern light, tracing the line towards Savannah, you can almost hear him whisper the same phrase he's written before. "I can make the march and make Georgia howl." The morning of November 16th dawns gray and sharp, the air cold enough to frost your breath. Dew glitters across the fields outside Atlanta, though the word fields feels generous. What remains is ash and rubble, charred timbers jutting like ribs from the earth. Sherman's men are lined up and ready. Behind them, the city they've gutted smolders like a dying campfire. Ahead of them lies 225 miles of unknown. The orders are clear. Begin the march to the sea. The bugles sound and the columns move, thousands of boots striking rhythm to a new kind of war. You can almost feel the tension humming through the ranks, a mixture of dread and exhilaration. Every man knows that once they leave, there's no going back. The supply lines are gone, railroads ripped up, telegraphs cut. They are ghosts marching through enemy country now, untethered, self-sufficient, and terrifyingly free. The rear guard sets the final fires. Atlanta's industrial quarter goes up in a roar. Warehouses packed with ammunition ignite like volcanic eruptions, hurling embers into the sky. Sherman has ordered that only military structures be destroyed, sparing churches and private homes. But fire doesn't recognize moral boundaries. A sudden wind picks up and sweeps through wooden neighborhoods. Within hours, half the city is ablaze. A soldier from the 5th Ohio later writes, "The city was one vast sea of flame. Roofs crashed like thunder. Iron rails twisted like serpents in the heat. Women and children flee into the streets clutching trunks, quilts, or simply each other." A Confederate diarist records the moment. "We stood and watched Atlanta die. Even the heavens seemed to burn." From a rise outside town, Sherman halts to look back one last time. The scene below glows red and black, the embodiment of his philosophy of hard war. His aides wait for him to say something. Finally, he murmurs, "When we're through here, the devil himself will need to rebuild." Then he spurs his horse and rides on. You march eastward with the left wing, the sounds of destruction fading behind you. The men are talkative, almost cheerful, as if shaking off the ghost of siege warfare. "Good riddance to the mud and trenches," someone laughs. Another replies, "Aye, and good riddance to the smell." But beneath the humor, every man senses the danger. They are cutting themselves loose from the Union world. No reinforcements, no telegraph lines, only the long road and their general's grim confidence. Each corps carries just 20 days of rations: flour, salt, coffee, and a little meat. After that, they must live off the land. A regiment from Illinois nicknames themselves the "We Eat Whatever We Find Club." They'll soon prove it. Sherman rides ahead with his staff, notebook open on the saddle. His eyes constantly scan the horizon. To him, geography is a weapon. He's mapped every road, every river, every potential crossing point from Atlanta to the coast. His plan is to move in two main wings, Slocum's men to the north, Howard's to the south, each roughly 30 miles apart. Confederate forces will have no idea which route he truly favors, Augusta or Savannah, and by the time they guess, it'll be too late. Not far from you, cavalry detachments under Judson Kilpatrick sweep the flanks. Kilpatrick is brash, vain, and utterly fearless. Soldiers call him Kill Cavalry for his reckless charges, though he takes the nickname as a compliment. He's the perfect foil to Sherman's cold logic, a firebrand leading raids that terrify local militias. Whenever smoke rises in the distance, someone says, "That's just Kilpatrick saying hello." By the second day, the march stretches for more than 50 miles. Roads turn to rivers of mud as wagons and artillery grind them into pulp. Mules bray, men curse, and yet the machine keeps moving. Engineers lay temporary bridges across creeks and rivers, planks and rope lashed together by lamplight. Sherman insists on efficiency. No stopping for bad weather, no dawdling for stragglers. "We're a moving storm," he says, and storms do not wait. At night, the camps glow with hundreds of small fires. The smell of roasting corn and pork drifts through the trees. Soldiers repair shoes, clean rifles, or swap stories about home. One man from Indiana swears that if he survives, he'll never eat corn again. Another bets he'll name his first child Savannah. You can't help but laugh, though part of you wonders whether any of them will actually make it that far. Among the officers, talk turns to strategy. Sherman's subordinates understand that this campaign isn't just about territory, it's about psychology. The quicker we end it, the fewer graves to dig, one major says. We burn now, so fewer burn later. Historians still debate whether this logic holds. Was Sherman's devastation truly merciful in the long term, or did it scar the South for generations? Along the route, the army leaves a trail of eerie beauty. Burned cotton gins smolder like blackened skeletons. Bridges collapse into rivers with echoing groans. Telegraph wires hang like cobwebs between scorched poles. The soldiers call the destruction Sherman's visiting cards. Occasionally, they pass towns that look untouched, places spared by discipline or luck. Children watch silently from porches as the blue tide rolls by. Sometimes a soldier tosses them hardtack or candy. Other times, an officer warns them indoors. One preacher in Covington waves a Bible and shouts that God will punish such cruelty. A passing private yells back, "He's late," and the column erupts in laughter. War has turned blasphemy into comedy. You begin to notice how the army's rhythm mimics breath. Inhale, advance. Exhale, destroy. Even the foragers, or bummers, move with ritual precision. They spread out each morning in squads of 10, scouring the countryside for food and valuables. They bring back wagons piled with hams, chickens, barrels of molasses, and the occasional piano. Some even return with captured livestock, wearing Union blue ribbons. Sherman encourages foraging, but demands discipline. Take what's needed, avoid cruelty. Still, chaos breeds opportunists. Not every soldier resists temptation. When one lieutenant catches a private looting a farmhouse, he makes him carry a pig tied around his neck for a day as punishment. The men nickname him General Pork. It becomes a running joke for weeks. One evening, near Lithonia, you come across an abandoned plantation house. The air smells of magnolia and smoke. Inside, Union soldiers rummage through rooms filled with fine furniture and portraits of grim-faced ancestors. On a table lies a family Bible, its pages singed at the edges. Someone reads aloud from it, Psalms of all things. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Outside, another unit sets fire to the barn. As the flames catch, the night fills with the crackling of wood and the hiss of steam from wet hay. Firelight flickers across faces, young, old, hardened, afraid. For a moment, you realize you're not just burning buildings. You're burning history, lineage, entire generations of memory. And yet, the march presses on. By November 18th, the army crosses the Yellow River. Confederate scouts fire sporadically from the tree line, but resistance remains scattered. Wheeler's cavalry ambushes a foraging party, killing several and capturing others. Rumor spreads that Wheeler has ordered any caught looting to be executed. Sherman responds by tightening the guard on foragers but refuses to slow down. They can kill 10, 20, he says, but we'll still eat tonight. The scale of destruction grows. Whole miles of railroad vanish. Telegraph stations are dynamited. Smoke pillars mark the army's passage like mileposts. One war correspondent writes, "It is as if a black brush were painting Georgia off the map. Yet, for all the devastation, there are moments of eerie calm. In one village, a group of freed slaves approach the marching column, singing softly. The song is old, full of longing and faith. Steal away to Jesus." The soldiers stop to listen, some removing their hats. For a brief instant, the war feels almost holy, a strange communion between destroyers and the newly freed. That night, as you lie under the stars, you think about the scale of what you're part of. This isn't just an army passing through. It's a rewriting of reality. Sherman's men aren't merely soldiers. They're instruments of transformation, reshaping the land, the people, and even the idea of war itself. You close your eyes to the distant glow of fires on the horizon, and the thought drifts through your mind. If hell had a horizon, it would look like Georgia tonight. By late November, the march has become a rhythm you can feel in your bones. Boots, drums, wind, and smoke. You wake to the sound of bugles and the faint smell of ashes that never seems to leave your clothes. The countryside stretches out in endless shades of brown and gold, dotted with chimneys that stand alone like gravestones. Each one marks where a house once stood, a silent reminder that the Union Army passed this way. The men call this part of the journey the hungry days. The further they go, the scarcer everything becomes. The foragers still bring back livestock and corn, but not as much as before. Whole counties have been picked clean by both armies over the past year. Still, Sherman's army moves forward like a tide that refuses to ebb. "We'll live off the land," he told them, and somehow, impossibly, they do. You march past the ruins of a sawmill, its great wheel frozen mid-turn. A soldier from Wisconsin taps it with the butt of his rifle and says, "There goes another job for the devil's carpenter." Everyone laughs, but the laughter dies quickly. Hunger has a way of thinning jokes. Sherman rides near the front, as always. He's a strange figure, equal parts philosopher and warlord. When a war correspondent asks if he feels pity for Georgia's suffering, he replies, "I do, but pity is a poor substitute for victory." Then, as if sensing the moral weight of his words, he adds softly, "I'll make war so terrible that generations will beg to avoid it again." Historians still debate whether this marks the true beginning of total war. Some argue that Sherman never targeted civilians directly, only the infrastructure sustaining the Confederate military. Others insist that in practice, there was little difference. To the people of Georgia, the distinction was academic. The result was the same. Foraging parties, those infamous bummers, become both heroes and villains of the march. Officially, they're supposed to requisition supplies from plantations, offering receipts redeemable by the US government after the war. In reality, the receipts are little more than paper jokes. When soldiers hand one to a farmer, it's like saying, "Here's a promise from the people who just took your mules." You walk with one of these foraging squads one morning, wading through tall yellow grass toward a farmhouse near Sandersville. The place looks deserted, windows boarded, smokehouse empty. A soldier pries open the barn door and discovers a pit full of sweet potatoes hidden under hay. "A miracle," he shouts. Within minutes, men swarm like ants, hauling the potatoes into sacks. The owner, a woman in a tattered black dress, appears in the doorway, trembling. "You'll starve us," she whispers. One of the soldiers pauses, sets 3 potatoes on the porch, and says quietly, "You'll need these more than we do." It's the kind of mercy that never makes the history books, but it happens more often than you'd think. Even in the heart of destruction, there are flickers of decency. Small, tired acts that mean nothing to strategy, but everything to humanity. By the 22nd, the army nears the Oconee River, where Confederate militia have set up a token defense. The fight that follows is brief and chaotic. Musket volleys echo through the pines, artillery shells splash in the water, and within hours, the gray ranks scatter. When it's over, Union engineers lay pontoon bridges while the men rest along the riverbanks, boots dangling in the cold current. Someone fishes using a bent bayonet. Another sits on a log carving, "To hell with Jeff Davis," into the wood. The march resumes through Washington County. Rain falls in relentless sheets, turning the roads into rivers of mud. Wagons sink up to their axles. Mules collapse and are shot where they stand. The soldiers begin calling themselves the Mud Marchers. One private from Ohio jokes that his boots are now more Georgia than leather. Sherman, unbothered, urges them on. "Keep the columns tight," he says. Mud slows everyone equally. One night, the rain turns to fog so thick you can barely see the man ahead of you. The world shrinks to sound, the squelch of boots, the creak of harnesses, the occasional curse as someone stumbles. You realize how eerily quiet the countryside has become. Birds are gone, dogs are silent, and even the wind seems to hold its breath. It's as if the land itself is waiting for the army to pass before daring to live again. Amid the endless march, word filters through the ranks about Lincoln's re-election earlier that month. The men cheer when they hear it. "4 more years!" someone shouts, and a chorus of hoarse voices answers. Sherman allows himself a rare smile. He knows what that victory means. The North won't give up now. The war will end, one way or another, with the Confederacy's defeat. Still, the human cost is impossible to ignore. Along the route, hundreds of formerly enslaved people join the columns, men, women, and children, carrying whatever they can. Some drive ox carts. Others walk barefoot for miles, clutching babies wrapped in quilts. They call Sherman's army the Freedom Train. The soldiers share food when they can, though the sheer number of followers creates chaos. Sherman worries they'll slow the march, but he can't bring himself to turn them away entirely. At one crossing, you watch as a small boy, maybe 6 years old, sits on a wagon beside his mother. His eyes are wide, his face smeared with soot. He asks a passing soldier, "Mister, is freedom close?" The soldier hesitates, then nods. "Closer than yesterday, son." The boy smiles, and for a moment, even the mud feels lighter beneath your boots. But not everyone welcomes the freed people. Confederate cavalry continue to harass the columns, attacking isolated foragers and targeting those who trail behind. Stories circulate of Wheeler's men executing captured black followers as runaway property. Sherman's response is pragmatic, almost chilling. "We can't protect everyone. Tell them to keep up or stay behind." His words sound cruel, but they reveal the cold truth of command. There's no mercy in logistics. By November 24th, the left wing reaches Milledgeville as word spreads through the army like wildfire. Georgia's capital has fallen. Soldiers shout, "Hurrah for Uncle Billy!" and light cigars in celebration. Sherman enters the city the next morning, riding past the State House where Confederate flags hang limply in the drizzle. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone. The heart of Georgia has been cut open, and the Confederacy bleeds from within. Inside the Capitol, the soldiers discover the legislature's desks still covered in papers and half-burned candles. On one desk lies a resolution supporting secession. On another, a letter from Governor Brown ordering citizens to resist the invader. A few officers stage a mock session of their own, repealing secession amid laughter and applause. It's gallows humor, but it hits home. For a brief moment, the Union truly governs Georgia again, by force and by flame. Outside, the destruction continues. Cotton bales stacked near the river burst into flame, sending clouds of ash swirling into the rain. The plantation of former Governor Howell Cobb, one of the Confederacy's most vocal defenders, is torched under Sherman's personal supervision. His mansion burns to its foundations, though the slave quarters are spared. A few soldiers murmur that it's poetic justice. One officer, watching the blaze, says quietly, "The old world's burning, boys. Best let it." That night, you sit by the Oconee River and watch the firelight reflecting off the water. The wind smells of pine and smoke and something else. Finality, maybe. You realize that Georgia will never be the same again. The rails can be rebuilt, the barns restocked, but something deeper has been broken. The myth of invincibility, the belief that war could stay at a distance. Sherman's march has dragged it into every parlor, every churchyard, every dream. You lean back, staring at the stars through drifting smoke, and think about what the general said. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. In the flicker of the flames, you understand what he meant, not as philosophy, but as lived truth. And the march goes on. The army leaves Milledgeville behind on the morning of November 24th, the smoke of its fires still curling into the gray sky. You can smell the scorched cotton for miles, a sweet, acrid scent that clings to your uniform and follows you down the road. The columns fan out once again, spreading eastward like dark fingers through Georgia's heartland. Sherman has achieved what he wanted. The Confederate government in Georgia is scattered, and the capital lies humiliated. But the hardest part of the journey still lies ahead. The land begins to change as you move farther southeast. Gone are the hills and red clay roads. In their place come flat, sandy plains and pine forests that whisper in the wind. The soil here is thinner, poorer, the farms smaller, You can see the toll that years of war and blockade have taken. Fields lie fallow, fences rot, and livestock are scarce. Some houses stand empty, their doors swinging loose in the wind. Others are occupied by families who stare silently as the army passes, too proud or too afraid to speak. You hear the first rumors that Confederate cavalry under General Joseph Wheeler is closing in again. Wheeler has become a phantom presence on the march, never seen for long, always near enough to sting. His men attack foraging parties, ambush couriers, and vanish into the woods. Sometimes they kill captured Union soldiers outright. The men respond by marching with fingers on their triggers. You begin to sense that this war is shedding whatever thin veneer of rules it once had. At night, foragers return to camp with their usual bounty: smoked hams, barrels of flour, and chickens tied together by the feet. But they also tell darker stories. Farmers whipped for refusing to reveal hidden stores. Barns burned when no food was found. One soldier from Illinois jokes that Georgia's learning the meaning of Sherman's hospitality. No one laughs this time. Sherman himself seems unmoved. When an aide brings him reports of looting, he shrugs. War is war, he says. We cannot change its nature. We can only direct it. He orders tighter discipline on paper, but continues urging his men to live off the land. The contradiction defines the campaign. Destruction guided by calculation, chaos wrapped in order. One evening, you're assigned to a detachment guarding a small village rumored to harbor Confederate scouts. The place looks peaceful enough: whitewashed houses, a small church, a row of cotton sheds. Then, just after dusk, shots ring out from the tree line. A volley of musket fire splinters the church steeple. The soldiers dive for cover and fire back into the dark. When the skirmish ends, Wheeler's raiders are gone, leaving 2 Union men dead and 1 wounded. Sherman's response is swift and cold. He orders the town's storehouses burned and its rail depot demolished. You help stack barrels of turpentine inside the wooden structure before the engineers light their torches. The explosion is deafening. Flames leap skyward, painting the night red. A soldier beside you mutters, "They'll think twice before shooting from their porches again." But even as you nod, you feel something uneasy stir inside you. Revenge has a taste, and it's bitter. As the army marches on, the civilians grow more desperate. Many bury their valuables, silver, jewelry, family heirlooms, in their yards or fields. Some even hide food in coffins, hoping the Yankees won't disturb the dead. But foragers have become experts at finding such caches. They probe the earth with bayonets, uncovering hidden jars of molasses or buried barrels of grain. The men call these finds Yankee miracles. To the families watching, they're acts of desecration. There's one story that spreads through the camps like wildfire. A widow who buried her family's gold beneath a rosebush and begged Union soldiers not to dig it up. The captain in charge supposedly spared the bush, but when she returned after the army left, the earth beneath it had been neatly excavated. In its place, she found a note pinned to the stem, compliments of Uncle Billy. Historians still debate whether the story is true, but like all war legends, its truth lies in its believability. Not every encounter ends in ruin. Near Sandersville, you pass a plantation where the owner, a weary old man with a white beard, stands on his porch as the soldiers approach. Instead of protesting, he waves a handkerchief and says, "You boys will be wanting food." When the foragers finish loading the wagons, they find he's left a jug of whiskey by the gate with a note, "May this end soon for us all." One corporal raises the jug in salute before the column moves on. Even amid the ashes, civility occasionally flickers. But for every quiet act of grace, there's another of brutality. Confederate cavalry intensifies its raids, ambushing isolated foraging squads and executing prisoners. One morning, word spreads that Wheeler's men have hanged 2 captured Union foragers from a tree as a warning. Sherman hears of it and orders retaliation, not by killing, but by acceleration. "We will march faster," he tells his staff. "They cannot catch what they cannot overtake." And so the pace increases. Rain begins to fall again, a steady drizzle that soaks uniforms and turns roads to mire. The wagons creak like dying animals, and the men curse with every step. When a mule collapses, it's unhitched and left where it falls. The army moves on relentlessly. A chaplain writes that the march feels less like war and more like the tide, slow, inexorable, and indifferent to everything it touches. One evening, the columns halt by a burned plantation. A few chimneys stand like sentinels against the sunset. The men pitch camp in the ruins. You find yourself sitting on a pile of bricks beside an old slave cabin that somehow survived the fire. Inside, a group of freed people are huddled around a small fire, singing softly. The melody drifts into the night. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. The words seem to wrap around the whole army like a lament. A young black man named Isaac, newly freed, approaches the camp. He tells Sherman that Wheeler's cavalry captured his brother 2 days ago and that they plan to sell him back into slavery across the river. Sherman listens silently, then says, "Tell your people to stay close to the army. We will not stop for them, but we will not turn them away." It's compassion framed in cruelty, a policy that saves some but abandons others. By November 26th, you reach the Ogeechee River, where the terrain shifts again. Swamps spread out in all directions, their waters dark and still as glass. Cypress trees rise like pillars from the muck, draped in ghostly moss. The road vanishes into endless puddles and reeds. The soldiers use fence rails to test the depth of the water before wading in. Leeches cling to their legs, and the air hums with mosquitoes, even in the cool season. You can hear the men joking through their misery. Georgia's finest resort. No beds, no roof, plenty of bugs. The march through the swamps becomes a nightmare. Wagons bog down axle deep. Horses stumble and drown in the mud. The engineers work night and day to lay crude corduroy roads, logs laid side by side, to support the weight of artillery. When the columns finally emerge onto solid ground, cheers erupt spontaneously. The men joke that they've marched through hell and came out dry on the other side. But there's no time to rest. Wheeler's cavalry is still out there, and Confederate scouts continue shadowing the columns. At one crossing, shots ring out from a stand of pines, killing a Union officer instantly. Sherman rides forward, surveys the body, and says only, "Keep moving." His voice is quiet, but iron hard. Nothing will slow him now. That night, you camp beneath the stars, too tired to eat. The distant sky flickers with reflected fire. Another depot, another town. You stare upward, wondering what this march must look like from above. 1,000 pinpricks of fire crawling across Georgia, each one leaving a scar behind. You imagine the Confederacy watching from some divine height and realizing at last that the war is slipping away. 1 mile, 1 ember, 1 footstep at a time. As you drift towards sleep, a soldier beside you mutters, "Reckon Uncle Billy's right. We're making Georgia howl." And somewhere in the dark, a whippoorwill calls, its lonely cry echoing through the ruins. By the time the army reaches the outskirts of Milledgeville, the damp chill of late November has settled deep into everyone's bones. The march that began with the roar of burning Atlanta now moves under a low gray sky, its thunder replaced by the steady squelch of mud beneath boots and wheels. You're numb to it now. The endless rhythm of tramping feet, the groan of wagon axles, the rustling of corn sacks tied to saddles. War has become routine, as ordinary as breathing. When word spreads that you've reached the Georgia capital, the columns erupt in cheers. "Old Billy's bagged another one," someone shouts. Sherman's men, who have marched hundreds of miles through hostile country, finally taste a kind of triumph. No Confederate army has stood in their way. Wheeler's cavalry has harried the flanks, yes, but in the grand scheme, Georgia lies wide open. Milledgeville is a small town, really. Quiet streets, a white-domed capitol, a few brick buildings, and a scattering of homes with picket fences. Once, it had been the political heartbeat of the state, where delegates shouted speeches about states' rights and toasted the Confederacy's destiny. Now, That destiny is collapsing under the weight of 60,000 boots. The Confederate governor has fled south, taking his records and his pride with him. The men pour into the streets singing John Brown's Body and the Star-Spangled Banner. They wave captured Confederate flags like hunting trophies. But what begins as jubilation quickly turns strange. Inside the State House, soldiers discover the empty chamber of the Georgia legislature. Someone jokes, "Why not hold our own session?" Within minutes, 100 laughing men crowd the floor. A sergeant bangs a musket on the speaker's desk and bellows, "This session will come to order." You can't help but grin as the mock proceedings begin. One soldier stands and declares, "Gentlemen, I move that Georgia rejoin the Union immediately and unconditionally." Another shouts, "Seconded." The motion passes with raucous cheers and mock applause. They even draft a parody bill repealing secession. When they sign it, they use quill pens found in the desks, probably the same ones that once penned the original secession documents. The humor is rough, but it's pointed. Every man in that room understands the symbolism. Georgia's heart has fallen without a single major battle. The Confederacy's illusion of invulnerability has shattered. Outside, the mood is less theatrical. Foragers swarm through the town's outskirts, searching for food and fuel. Warehouses are emptied, mills dismantled, and rail yards stripped bare. Sherman's orders are clear: destroy any facility that might aid the Confederate cause. His engineers move with professional precision, smashing machinery, spilling grain, and setting fire to piles of cotton. But as always, control is a fragile thing. When night falls, fires begin to spread beyond their intended targets. Cotton sparks leap to nearby roofs. The dry wood catches instantly. The glow lights up the clouds like sunrise, and soon half the city burns. Sherman's orders to spare churches and homes are lost in the chaos. You walk past a row of houses with their windows glowing red from the reflection of flames. A woman stands in one doorway, clutching a baby, her face streaked with soot and tears. She doesn't say a word, doesn't curse or beg, just stares as the soldiers march by. You feel her eyes on your back long after you've passed. By morning, Milledgeville smolders. The air smells of wet ash and smoke. Sherman rides through the ruins, his horse's hooves clopping softly over the charred earth. He says nothing, only removes his hat briefly as he passes the ruined statehouse. One of his aides later recalls that he looked like a man carrying a great weight he would never put down. There's a story, half rumor, half gospel among the soldiers, that Sherman found a copy of a Confederate newspaper in the ruins that morning. On its front page was a proclamation boasting that Atlanta shall never fall while a Georgian draws breath. Sherman supposedly folded the paper, tucked it into his coat pocket, and said, "I'll show them what Georgians breathe now." Whether he actually said it or not, the men repeat the line until it becomes legend. Near Milledgeville, the army passes the plantation of former Governor Howell Cobb, a wealthy, defiant man who once declared that the Union can never hold together without slavery. Sherman orders it destroyed personally. His soldiers torch the mansion, its grand columns glowing like candles in the twilight. But he specifically spares the slave quarters. "Let them see," he tells his aides, "that we burn power, not people." Historians still argue over whether this act was symbolic restraint or just another mask for cruelty. To Sherman, the distinction is meaningless. He's convinced that every plantation burned hastens the war's end. In his mind, every ruined barn is another nail in the Confederacy's coffin. As the fires die down, a strange quiet settles over the camp. Rain begins to fall, a steady drizzle that turns ashes into gray mud. Soldiers huddle under tarps, playing cards or cleaning rifles. A band somewhere starts to play Home Sweet Home, its melody faint and melancholy. You catch yourself humming along before realizing how absurd it is. Home feels like a word that belongs to another world. The next morning, Sherman gathers his staff under a dripping oak to discuss the next phase of the campaign. His plan is evolving in real time, molded by terrain and opportunity. From here, he will push the right wing southeast towards Sandersville, then pivot south to cut the rail lines leading to Augusta and Savannah. The left wing will follow slightly north, feinting toward the Oconee River to keep Confederate forces guessing. Its strategy as fluid as smoke. And aide voices concern about Wheeler's cavalry and the growing number of freed slaves following the columns. Sherman listens, nods, then replies in his clipped, matter-of-fact tone. We move as one body. Those who keep up, live. Those who fall behind, fall behind. It's harsh, but the army understands. They are a storm, not a sanctuary. That night, the rain finally stops and the stars return, cold and bright above the burned-out town. The soldiers settle in for the evening. Fires flicker through the camp, their light catching on bayonets and tin cups. Someone finds a half-destroyed piano in a gutted house and drags it to the square. It's missing half its keys, but that doesn't stop the music. A rough chorus rises around it, voices tired but determined. We'll hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree. You sit nearby, the melody mingling with the crackle of embers and the murmur of the Oconee River. For a fleeting moment, it feels peaceful, like the world has paused to breathe. Then you remember that tomorrow, the march begins again, and whatever peace this night offers will vanish with the dawn. Before you sleep, you glance back toward Milledgeville. The ruins glow faintly under the moonlight, smoke still drifting from the governor's mansion. Somewhere out there, perhaps in the ashes, lies the charred emblem of Georgia's defiance. And for all the destruction, you can't shake the sense that this strange mixture of ruin and resolve is exactly what Sherman wanted. A war that conquers not just armies, but the imagination. As you close your eyes, you hear the faint echo of his voice from earlier that day, half a whisper carried on the wind. We'll make them remember. This march for 100 years. You have no doubt that they will. The rain tapers off as the columns leave Milledgeville behind, the morning air heavy with that metallic smell that follows a storm. Mud still clings to your boots as the army winds its way deeper into the Georgia countryside. The landscape ahead feels emptier, lonelier, towns fewer, homes smaller, and every face that watches from the roadside a little more hollowed by fear and hunger. Sherman's army has become both myth and rumor, and Georgia trembles beneath its passing. The destruction is now almost mechanical. Engineers and pioneers move ahead to dismantle the infrastructure that once fed the Confederate war machine. Rail lines are torn up mile after mile, iron rails stacked over bonfires until they glow red, then twisted around tree trunks into grotesque spirals. The men laugh as they work, calling them Sherman's neckties. The phrase catches on, spreading through the ranks like a campfire song. A few soldiers even start hanging the twisted metal from wagons as souvenirs, the way hunters display antlers. You stand watching one of these crews at work near the Oconee River Bridge. The firelight flickers against sweating faces, and the sound of bending iron fills the night, a shriek somewhere between music and pain. When the last rail is twisted into a loop, one soldier salutes it with mock solemnity. "Rest easy, Johnny Reb," he says. "Your trains won't be running through here no more." Historians still debate whether Sherman's destruction of railroads was military necessity or calculated theater. But if you're here to see it, there's no question, it's both. Each rail twisted, each depot leveled, is as much a message as a military tactic. The Confederacy, Sherman is telling the South, is not merely losing battles, it's being unmade. The work continues by torchlight. Men haul tar barrels into warehouses, smash casks of molasses, and scatter grain onto the mud. Horses stamp nervously in their traces, their flanks shining like polished bronze in the firelight. The night smells of tar, sugar, and smoke, a perfume of ruin. One young soldier nearby, barely 17, stares into the flames and murmurs, "I never thought war could be so quiet while it kills so much." You look at him, unsure whether he's talking to you or himself. When dawn comes, the scene looks almost biblical. The bridge is gone, the rails melted into sculptures of black iron. The sun rises behind drifting smoke, turning the sky the color of old blood. Sherman rides through the ruins, expression unreadable, his uniform dusted with ash. He pauses to study the twisted rails, then nods with something like satisfaction. "Good," he says softly. "Let the people see." The army moves east again. Each column leaves behind a swath of destruction, nearly 60 miles wide. To the north, Slocum's men pass through towns with names like Eatonton and Sandersville, their smoke visible from miles away. To the south, Howard's corps presses through the Pine Barrens, seizing livestock and tearing up the Central Georgia Railroad. It's as if the two wings are giant blades cutting parallel scars across the state. As the march pushes on, foraging parties grow bolder. Sherman's written orders tell them to take only what's necessary and avoid harming civilians. But out in the field, the line between necessity and greed blurs fast. One squad raids a storehouse and discovers barrels of sorghum syrup. By sunset, every soldier in camp is sticky, laughing as they wrestle like boys at a harvest fair. Another party stumbles upon a stash of Confederate whiskey. By nightfall, discipline dissolves in a haze of singing and bad fiddle music. The general himself rides through the camp, surveys the chaos, and mutters, "My army could whip the devil sober, but God help us when they're drunk." Still, he doesn't punish them harshly. Perhaps he understands that the laughter, the feasting, even the looting are part of what keeps these men human amid the wreckage. War this long has to feed on something other than orders. One of the most curious sights of the march comes a few days later, when a detachment arrives at a plantation near Tennille. The owner, a wealthy planter who fled days earlier, left behind a library filled with fine books. Soldiers wander through the halls flipping pages, laughing at titles like the Southern Gentleman's Code of Honor and the Cotton Kingdom of Dixie. One man finds a copy of Macaulay's History of England and begins reading aloud by the light of a burning chandelier, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "Strange how men never learn," he says. Then he tosses the book onto the fire. That night, the plantation burns like a beacon visible for 20 miles. Some men watch silently, others cheer. You can't help wondering what the fire must look like from Savannah, still more than 100 miles away, but surely bright enough to stain the horizon red. And yet, not everything in Sherman's path turns to ash. Some soldiers, moved by pity or simple fatigue, spare what they can. They hand bread to hungry children, fix broken doors, even mend fences they didn't destroy. It's as though the army itself can't decide whether it's a destroyer or a liberator. One officer writes home that he feels like God on Sunday, building and unbuilding the world in equal measure. But the Confederates are never far. Wheeler's cavalry continues to strike at the edges of the column. They kill stragglers, ambush foragers, and vanish again into the pine woods. Once, they manage to capture a wagon train loaded with foraged corn and bacon, slaughtering the guards. Sherman's response is swift. He orders several nearby towns stripped bare and their depots burned. "We must leave nothing the enemy can use," he insists. His logic is simple. Deny the Confederates food, and their will collapses faster than their armies. One evening, near the village of Davisboro, the soldiers discover a massive cotton gin still operating despite the war. Sherman orders it destroyed. As the men set fire to the bales, someone plays Dixie on a captured banjo, slow and mournful. The tune drifts across the flames, mocking and melancholy all at once. "That's the last cotton Georgia'll gin for Jeff Davis," a soldier remarks. The irony cuts deep. They're burning the very symbol of the South's pride. As days blur together, the march becomes a living myth. Rumors spread ahead of the army faster than the soldiers themselves. That Sherman commands 100,000 men, that he breathes fire, that he carries torches instead of maps. Mothers frighten children into obedience by whispering his name. Even Confederate soldiers start calling him the Red Devil. You can't help smiling when you hear the stories. The truth is more ordinary and perhaps more terrifying. Sherman doesn't need to be a monster. He just needs to be inevitable. Late one night, you stop to rest near a rail yard that's been completely dismantled. The only sound is the crackle of cooling iron. The sky above is vast and clear, full of stars. A sergeant sits beside you and says quietly, "You ever think we'll regret this?" You shrug, unsure. "Maybe," you say, "but history's written by the ones who keep walking." He nods, then adds, "Guess that makes us the authors, huh?" You both laugh, though it sounds more like exhaustion than humor. The next morning, the march resumes at dawn. Columns snake through the trees, their bayonets catching the light like ripples on water. Behind them, the land smokes. Ahead, the air smells faintly of salt, the first whisper of the sea. Savannah isn't far now. The men can almost taste it. As you march, you realize something strange. The destruction behind you no longer feels like cruelty. It feels like gravity. Every broken rail, every burned barn, every fleeing family, they're all part of a single inexorable motion, a world ending so another can begin. And when you look toward the horizon, where the sky meets the endless pine forests of coastal Georgia, you think you can see it already, the faint shimmer of the Atlantic, waiting to swallow the fire whole. The road to the coast winds through a changing Georgia. The red clay and open farmland of the interior give way to cypress lowlands and blackwater swamps, where the air hangs thick with the smell of rot and pine resin. You can hear frogs croaking from the flooded ditches and see mist coiling over stagnant ponds. The men joke that they're marching through soup now, but there's nothing funny about it. The wagons bog down constantly, and the soldiers spend half their time knee-deep in muck, pushing, hauling, cursing, then laughing because the alternative is despair. Sherman's engineers work miracles. They fell trees and lay them crosswise into the mud to build corduroy roads, the logs clattering under the wagon wheels like a drumbeat. Progress slows to a crawl, 5 miles a day, sometimes less. But the march never stops. The general's orders are unambiguous. Keep moving. Every delay means more time for Confederate cavalry to regroup, more time for supplies to run low, and more time for sickness to spread. Food is the constant obsession. The foragers, bummers as always, range out like locusts. They raid smokehouses, strip fields bare, and even seize rice from flooded paddies where enslaved people once labored. What they can't carry, they burn. One of the soldiers jokes that Georgia will have to import its next harvest from the moon. The men laugh, but not too loud. Their own bellies growl. They've been living for weeks on cornmeal, bacon, and whatever livestock they can steal or trade for. Coffee is a rare treasure now. 1 cup can buy you half a chicken. Everywhere the columns go, freed people appear, drawn as if by magnetism. They come in 2s and 10s and 100s. Old men on mules, mothers dragging children, young men carrying rifles they don't quite know how to use. They build campfires near the Union columns, singing and praying aloud. For them, Sherman's army is salvation. For the soldiers, they are both inspiration and burden. Each new group adds mouths to feed, slows the movement of the wagon trains, clogs the narrow swamp roads. Sherman tries to balance compassion with practicality. He assigns some of the freedmen to work as guides and laborers, clearing roads and building bridges. But when an aide suggests slowing the march to accommodate them, Sherman shakes his head. "We cannot stop for those who follow the sound of freedom," he says. "They must learn to walk with it." The words sound noble in print. In practice, they mean that hundreds are left behind when the columns move too fast. The soldiers do what they can. A corporal from Illinois writes in his diary, "We share our cornmeal with the darkies when we can. The children cling to us as if we were angels, though we are devils enough." The contradictions of the march seem endless. Destruction and liberation riding side by side down the same muddy road. Confederate resistance stiffens slightly as the army nears the coast. Wheeler's cavalry continues to harass the flanks, but now local militia join the fight. Old men and boys, most armed with hunting rifles or even scythes. They fire from tree lines and vanish into the brush. Sherman dismisses them as gnats that sting but cannot wound. Still, every day brings a handful of casualties, each one a grim reminder that even a broken enemy can still draw blood. At Sandersville, a minor skirmish erupts when Confederate cavalry tries to delay the Union advance. You hear the crack of carbines, the answering thunder of artillery, and the brief chaos of men shouting through smoke. When it's over, the rebels melt away, leaving only a few bodies and a burning wagon. One Union sergeant spits and says, "That's all they've got left, ashes and ghosts." The destruction that follows grows almost casual. Soldiers don't wait for orders anymore. They know what to do. Cotton bales go up in flames, smokehouses are emptied, bridges are dynamited. The path of the march becomes a moving scar visible from the sky. If anyone could have seen it from above, it would have looked like a black streak slashed across the green of Georgia. Even nature seems to join the war. The nights grow colder, the swamps steaming under a chill moon. Fires burn low for warmth, not celebration. You hear the coughs of men hacking up the marsh air, the groans of mules too exhausted to stand. Yet still, every dawn, the bugles sound and the men rise. Habit becomes endurance. Endurance becomes faith. By early December, the columns approach the Savannah River basin. The land here is strange, flat, half-flooded, stitched with winding creeks. The ocean is close enough that you can smell it in the wind, that faint tang of salt and decay. The men talk constantly about reaching the coast. They dream aloud of ships bringing coffee, fresh bread, even letters from home. Some joke that they'll walk straight into the sea and keep marching until they hit Europe. But between them and the ocean lies a final obstacle: the last organized Confederate defenses around Savannah, commanded by General William Hardee. His army is small, maybe 10,000 men, but they're dug in behind swamps and fortifications, backed by the guns of Fort McAllister, guarding the coast. Sherman knows he must secure a port before he can rest or resupply. And so, even as the men smell the salt air, they brace themselves for battle once more. As the army nears the Ogeechee River, skirmishes become more frequent. Wheeler's cavalry strikes again, this time more viciously. They capture several Union foragers, and rumor spreads that the prisoners were executed. The mood in camp darkens. Some of Sherman's men retaliate, burning every barn and mill within miles. "No quarter for thieves and killers," a lieutenant says grimly. The war that began as strategy now feels like vengeance unbound. One night, while the men huddle around fires on the riverbank, a strange light flickers on the horizon. At first, you think it's another burning town, but then someone points and whispers, "That's lightning over the sea." The thought hits like a revelation. The Atlantic is close enough to make its own weather visible. The men cheer softly, too tired to shout. After hundreds of miles, the end of the march is finally within reach. The next morning, Sherman rides to the front. His horse's hooves splash through the shallows of the Ogeechee. He surveys the vast marshes stretching toward the horizon and says quietly, "Gentlemen, we're almost there." An aide later claims the general smiled for the first time in weeks. As you march through the flooded lowlands, the line between land and water blurs completely. The army seems to be walking on the surface of the world, the ground trembling beneath the weight of 60,000 souls. The air smells of salt and smoke and victory. Somewhere behind you, Georgia still burns. Somewhere ahead, the sea waits, silent, vast, inevitable. You look down at your reflection in the dark water and barely recognize yourself. The mud, the smoke, the exhaustion. They've erased the person who left Atlanta weeks ago. In his place walks someone harder, leaner, stranger. You wonder if Sherman feels the same when he looks in a mirror, or if he's long stopped looking. That night, the moon rises over the marshes, silvering the flooded fields. Fires glimmer like stars scattered across the water. The men sit in silence, too weary to talk. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bugle sounds taps, soft and slow. It echoes across the marsh until it fades into the sigh of the tide. Tomorrow, the army will push on towards Savannah. Tonight, for the first time since Atlanta, you can smell the ocean, and it smells like the end of the world. The morning of December 8th dawns under a pale, washed-out sky. Mist curls above the marshes, ghostly and white, clinging to the low branches of cypress trees. The men are silent as they march. Every footstep sends ripples across the flooded road. The swamp smells of rot and salt, and somewhere out in the haze, a heron lifts off, its wings beating slow and heavy. You can feel it in your bones now. The march is nearing its end. Savannah lies less than 30 miles away. But before the sea, there's one more horror to pass through, one that will stain the memory of the campaign long after the smoke clears. It begins at a place few have heard of, Ebenezer Creek. The 14th Corps, under Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis, not to be confused with the Confederate president of the same name, leads the way. Davis is capable, but his temper is infamous. He's already clashed with his own officers during earlier campaigns, and now, under pressure to move fast, his patience has worn thin. For days, his men have been trailed by a massive crowd of freed people, hundreds of men, women, and children following the army's path toward what they believe is freedom. They travel on foot, in wagons, carrying what few possessions they still own. Some have walked all the way from Atlanta. When Davis's corps reaches the banks of Ebenezer Creek, the river is swollen from recent rains, dark and swift beneath a blanket of fog. Union engineers throw down pontoon bridges as the soldiers wait restlessly. The sound of hammers and rushing water fills the air. By nightfall, the army begins to cross. You watch the columns move steadily over the makeshift bridge, boards creaking under the weight of men, horses, and wagons. Behind you, the freed people wait their turn, watching with anxious eyes. A young woman clutches a sleeping baby to her chest. An old man leans on a stick, his hands shaking. Someone starts to sing a hymn, low and trembling. Oh freedom over me. By dawn, nearly all of Davis's soldiers have crossed to the far bank. Then the general gives a new order, quietly, coldly. Once the last regiment is across, the engineers are to cut the bridge loose. No explanation, no warning. Within minutes, the pontoons are pulled apart and drift downstream, leaving hundreds of freed people stranded on the wrong side. You hear the first cries almost immediately. Wait for us! The crowd surges toward the water's edge, panic spreading as they see the bridge vanish. Some wade in, trying to swim the current. The river swallows them. Others cling to logs or branches, their screams echoing through the mist. Confederate cavalry appears in the distance, Wheeler's men still shadowing the army, and chaos explodes. The freed people scatter into the swamp. Many are cut down or captured. One Union officer, Captain Charles Kerr, later writes, "It was a scene which can never be erased from my mind." You wish you could say the same. The soldiers on the far bank watch helplessly as the tragedy unfolds. Some shout curses at Davis. Others fire warning shots over the river to scare off the Confederate riders. But the damage is done. When the survivors finally stagger across at another crossing miles downstream, many are missing. Wives, children, friends, vanished into the black water of Ebenezer Creek. The incident spreads like wildfire through the army. Sherman's headquarters receives reports that night. Some of his officers demand Davis's removal. Sherman listens, jaw clenched, then says simply, "It is done. We have no time for courts of inquiry." He knows there's no going back. The war moves too fast for justice. Historians still argue about the meaning of that order. Some claim Davis acted on logistical necessity. He feared the freed people would slow the march and expose his corps to attack. Others see it as pure callousness, a stain of cruelty on an otherwise calculated campaign. Whatever the reason, the result is the same: hundreds dead, drowned, or re-enslaved. Later, when reporters question Sherman about the event, he refuses to condemn his subordinate outright. But the memory lingers. Months later, when the war ends, Sherman will sign Field Order 15, the directive granting parcels of confiscated Southern land to freed people along the coast. Some historians believe Ebenezer Creek haunted him into doing it. After the tragedy, the march continues grimly. The laughter and singing fade. Even the foragers grow quiet. The soldiers begin to talk less about glory and more about getting home. You can feel it, a shift in the air. They've seen too much, and the swamp seems to absorb their weariness. The next few days blur together. Rain falls in thin, cold sheets. The wagons crawl along half-flooded causeways. Horses stumble and sink in the mud. Food runs low again, and the men chew hardtack softened in rainwater. When a soldier finds a clutch of eggs in an abandoned henhouse, he guards them like treasure. Then, at last, a change. The smell of the sea grows stronger. The ground beneath your boots turns sandy, the air sharp with salt. Seagulls appear overhead, circling like ghosts. The men begin to murmur, "Savannah, Savannah." The word becomes a chant, almost a prayer. On December 10th, the advance guard reaches the outskirts of the city. Savannah lies behind a ring of fortifications held by Confederate General William Hardee. About 10,000 men, supported by heavy artillery. It's the first time in weeks that Sherman faces a real defensive line. The city itself, surrounded by tidal rivers and marshes, sits like a jewel in its watery crown. Sherman orders his troops to halt and dig in. He has no intention of repeating the costly sieges of the past. Instead, he sends scouts downriver to find a way to connect with the Union Navy, which he hopes is waiting offshore. If he can secure a supply line by sea, Savannah will fall without another drop of blood. The soldiers spend the next 2 days building entrenchments along the city's northern approaches. You can hear the axes chopping, the spades biting into wet soil. Skirmishes flare up across the marshes, brief bursts of gunfire followed by silence. Confederate snipers hide in the reeds, their shots echoing like thunderclaps. The men crouch behind earthen berms, peering through the fog, waiting for orders. On December 13th, Sherman's right wing strikes. Down by the coast, Union General William B. Hazen's leads a daring assault on Fort McAllister, a Confederate stronghold guarding the Ogeechee River mouth. The battle lasts barely 15 minutes. Hazen's men storm the fort through smoke and sand, bayonets flashing, and the Confederate defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, surrender. The signal rockets rise above the fort, streaking red and green into the twilight. The army cheers when they see them. The road to the sea is open at last. Union gunboats appear the next morning, their flags snapping in the wind. Crates of food and mail arrive from the ships, and for the first time in weeks, the men eat until they're full. A soldier writes home, "We have found the ocean, and it feels like finding the edge of the world." Another notes that when the men first tasted salt water, they cheered louder than at any victory. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone. After months of isolation, the Union Army has rejoined the wider world. Sherman rides down to the coast to inspect Fort McAllister. The Atlantic stretches before him, gray and vast. He stands for a long while in silence, his coat flapping in the sea breeze. When a correspondent asks what he plans next, he says simply, "I will give Savannah to the president." Behind him, the smoke of burned fields drifts over the marshes. Ahead, the ocean rolls on, indifferent and endless. The march to the sea, in all its terror and triumph, has reached the shore, but the war itself still waits, hungry for an ending. The guns of Fort McAllister still smell of powder when Sherman rides through its shattered gate. The defenders, mud-streaked, half-starved Confederates, stand in silence as the bluecoats march past. The fort's earthen walls are gouged with shell holes, the cannon muzzles black with soot. A single Confederate flag lies trampled in the sand, its colors bleached by salt and smoke. Sherman reins in his horse on the rampart and stares east. There it is, at last, the Atlantic, gray and infinite under a winter sun. You can almost hear the collective sigh ripple through the ranks. For weeks, the men have trudged through swamp and fire, chasing a horizon they couldn't see. Now, beyond the dunes, waves break in a steady rhythm, a sound that feels like proof the world still exists beyond Georgia. Someone starts to cheer, and within moments the whole fort erupts in noise, hats tossed, rifles raised, voices cracking from exhaustion and relief. They have marched more than 200 miles without supply lines through the enemy's heartland and come out alive. Sherman lets them celebrate for a while. Then he dismounts, pulls out his field glass, and surveys the coastline. Out on the water, tiny shapes move. Union gunboats, their masts sharp against the horizon. He smiles faintly. "We've struck the sea, gentlemen," he says to his staff. "Now we can shake hands with the Navy." That evening, a small boat pushes off from the captured fort, carrying a messenger flag. It rows through the surf toward the nearest Union ship, the USS Dandelion. When the sailors aboard realize who has arrived, they lower ropes, haul the drenched soldiers up, and burst into cheers. The message they carry is short but historic. "We have reached the sea. The city of Savannah is invested. For God's sake, send us supplies." When the answer comes the next morning, it's everything the men hoped for. The Navy has brought shiploads of rations, ammunition, and coffee. Glorious, steaming coffee. Barges ferry the supplies upriver to the hungry camps. Soldiers line up, laughing, shouting, even weeping as they drink. After weeks of moldy hardtack and stolen corn, the taste feels like home. Sherman, always practical, wastes no time. "Now that we're fed," he tells his officers, "let's finish the job." The last Confederate line stands around Savannah itself. General William Hardee commands roughly 10,000 defenders, veterans, militia, and hastily armed civilians. His troops are entrenched behind swamps and rivers, their cannons covering every approach. Hardee knows he can't win, but he intends to make the Yankees pay dearly. The city's civilians dig trenches alongside soldiers. Church bells are melted for shot. Slaves are forced to build barricades along the Savannah River. You see it as you approach the outskirts, the earthworks rising like scars across the landscape, the Spanish moss trembling in the wind above them. Sherman's men set up their own lines, digging in barely 2 miles from the city. Between the two armies lies a no-man's land of marshes and flooded rice fields, an expanse so treacherous that even cavalry can't cross it. It's a natural moat, and Hardee hopes it will buy him time. But Sherman has no interest in a siege. He's learned the futility of grinding assaults at places like Vicksburg and Kennesaw Mountain. Instead, he writes to Hardee, politely requesting the city's surrender. The message is brief, almost courteous. "I have already received communications from the mayor and citizens of Savannah, begging protection for life and property. I demand the surrender of your city to avoid the needless destruction of human life." Hardee, proud to the end, replies that Savannah will be defended to the last extremity. Sherman doesn't bother answering. He knows Hardee's position is hopeless. Instead, he begins tightening the noose. Union engineers construct batteries of heavy artillery on the firmest ground they can find. Pontoon bridges link the various corps so they can shift positions quickly. Cavalry under Judson Kilpatrick rides south to cut off the last rail line leading to Augusta. Within a few days, Savannah is completely encircled. No trains in, no telegraphs out. The men can taste victory, but they're careful now. Every night, sharpshooters trade fire across the marshes, the flashes lighting up the fog like fireflies. The smell of salt and gunpowder mixes in the damp air. One soldier writes home that the landscape looks like the end of creation itself. Inside Savannah, panic spreads. Civilians hoard food and water. Confederate soldiers strip the city of anything portable. The mayor convenes emergency meetings, but even he knows resistance is a formality. The city must be spared, he says. If we burn it as we flee, we become the same beasts we accuse Sherman of being. Hardee holds out another week, then faces reality. On the night of December 20th, under cover of darkness, he orders an evacuation. The Confederate garrison slips quietly across the Savannah River on pontoon bridges, heading into South Carolina before the Union lines close completely. They leave behind guns, supplies, and the illusion of control. At dawn, the city wakes to silence. No cannons, no bugles, only the faint hiss of wind through the palms. A few brave citizens venture into the streets and find Union pickets already there, their blue coats damp with dew. The mayor rides out under a white flag, hat in hand, to meet the invaders. He presents Sherman with the city's formal surrender. The general accepts it without ceremony. Later that day, he writes a telegram to Washington, one of the most famous in American history. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition. Also, about 25,000 bales of cotton. When President Lincoln reads it, he smiles for the first time in weeks. The war in Virginia still drags on, but Sherman's success has electrified the North. The newspapers print the telegram in bold letters. Citizens gather in the streets to sing and ring church bells. To a nation weary of death, the Christmas gift feels like proof that the end is near. In Savannah itself, the Union troops move cautiously through the elegant streets lined with oak trees and iron balconies. Sherman issues strict orders: no looting, no burning. This city is a prize, not a ruin, he tells his men, and miraculously, they obey. Compared with Atlanta's fiery fate, Savannah survives almost untouched. You walk through the squares that night, past flickering gas lamps and shuttered mansions. The air smells of salt and jasmine rather than smoke. A group of freed people kneel outside a church, praying aloud. One of them looks up at you and says, "Thank you, Mr. Soldier. The Lord done opened the sea for us." You don't know what to say, so you simply nod. Sherman establishes his headquarters in a grand white mansion overlooking the river. From the balcony, you can see Union ships anchored offshore, their lanterns glimmering like constellations. The march is over, but the general's mind is already turning north. Next, the Carolinas, you overhear him tell an aide. "We started this war in Charleston. Let's finish it there." Historians still argue over what Savannah meant. Some call it the proof of Sherman's genius, a campaign that crippled the Confederacy without a single major battle. Others see it as a symbol of his ruthlessness, a march that broke a nation's spirit through fear as much as fire. But standing here in the cool coastal air, you understand something simpler. The army has become a force of nature, and nature doesn't ask for moral approval. It just moves forward until there's nothing left to resist it. That night, fireworks bloom over the river. Captured Confederate munitions turned into celebration. The sky glows red, then gold, then blue. The men cheer and sing. You think of how far they've come, from the blackened ruins of Atlanta to this quiet city by the sea. Sherman watches from the balcony, hands clasped behind his back. "It's enough," he murmurs, though his eyes stay fixed northward, toward the Carolinas. The fires reflected in his gaze aren't just from the rockets above. They're from the memory of every town that burned on the way here, every field left in ashes. You can almost hear the whisper of the waves below, steady and indifferent. For the first time, you let yourself believe it. The Confederacy is dying. And somewhere far away, the rest of the Union is beginning to dream of peace. The air in Savannah smells of salt and iron. The tide rolls in and out with slow, heavy breath, rocking the ships moored along the docks where Union flags now flutter in the December breeze. For the first time in months, the army isn't marching. The men wander the cobbled streets like tourists in a ghost city, gaunt, soot-streaked, but grinning. They lounge in the shade of the live oaks, clean their rifles, and trade stories of the Great March, already mythologizing what they've just survived. Everywhere you look, the contrast is dizzying. The city's elegant squares, lined with magnolias and wrought iron balconies, seem untouched by war. But beyond the walls, Georgia still smolders, its fields black and bare. In that strange calm, You can almost forget that this same army burned its way here through hundreds of miles of countryside. Almost. Sherman sets up headquarters in a grand white mansion on Bull Street, once owned by Charles Greene, a wealthy English cotton broker. The irony is thick. Greene had once profited from the slave economy that funded the rebellion, and now his home houses the man who brought that system to its knees. Sherman's staff fills the rooms with maps, ledgers, and dispatches. The general himself keeps his quarters simple: camp cot, small desk, field trunk. He's a man who never seems comfortable among luxury. One morning, you find him standing on the balcony overlooking the Savannah River, hands clasped behind his back. Union ships drift below, their decks crowded with sailors waving to soldiers on shore. Sherman watches them quietly for a long time before saying, "I told Mr. Lincoln I'd make Georgia howl. I think she's had her fill." His voice carries no pride, only fatigue. The city itself begins to stir back to life. The citizens, at first wary, soon realize Sherman's occupation is nothing like the nightmare they'd imagined. His strict orders against looting are enforced with surprising severity. One soldier caught stealing silver is publicly whipped. Another who assaulted a civilian is sentenced to hard labor. "We are not vandals," Sherman tells his officers. "We are victors, and victors must behave." Still, fear lingers in every doorway. The local newspapers print cautious editorials pleading for calm. Some residents even approach Sherman with guarded respect. The city's mayor, Richard Arnold, writes in his journal, "General Sherman is courteous, almost gentle in speech, yet one feels that beneath it lies a will of steel." Food begins flowing again from Union supply ships. Freed people flock to the city in the thousands, setting up makeshift camps along the outskirts. They arrive barefoot, ragged, but smiling. Some find work unloading cargo or cleaning barracks. Others simply wander the streets, unsure what to do now that freedom is no longer a rumor, but a bewildering fact. Sherman faces an impossible question. What should become of them? The army can't support them all, yet turning them away feels cruel. He consults with his subordinates, most notably General Rufus Saxton and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who arrives from Washington to see the situation firsthand. They hold meetings in the same grand parlor where Confederate officers once toasted secession. The contrast is almost theatrical. During one meeting, a group of black ministers and community leaders are invited to speak. Among them is Reverend Garrison Frazier, a former slave in his 60s. When asked what his people need most, he answers with deliberate calm. "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor." The room falls silent. Sherman listens, then nods. Weeks later, he will issue Field Order Number 15, granting confiscated coastal land to freed people in 40-acre plots. It's a gesture born from both conscience and necessity. The first step, however fleeting, toward restitution. You walk the streets that evening as word spreads of the order. Freed families cluster around fires, talking excitedly about 40 acres and a mule. Some weep, others pray. No one knows yet that the promise will soon be revoked after Lincoln's death. But for this brief moment, hope feels tangible, like something you could hold in your hands. In the officers' quarters, celebration mingles uneasily with exhaustion. Letters arrive from home, carrying the joy of Christmas and the stunned gratitude of a nation. Sherman's telegram to Lincoln, "I beg to present you Savannah as a Christmas gift," has become headline news. Northern papers hail him as a hero. Even his critics in Washington, who once doubted his sanity, now call him the hammer of the Union. Yet the general himself seems detached from all the praise. He spends long hours pacing his study, dictating reports, marking new routes on his maps. The war isn't over, not yet. Lee still holds Virginia. Johnston still commands remnants of Confederate forces in the Carolinas. Sherman's mind, restless as ever, is already turning northward. "We've cut them in two," he tells his staff. "Now, we'll cut them again. He plans his next move with mathematical precision. His army will march through South Carolina, the very cradle of secession, and into North Carolina, linking with Grant near Raleigh. We'll march straight through their pride, he says. Let Charleston feel what Atlanta felt. The men who overhear him exchange uneasy glances. They know what that means. In the meantime, Savannah becomes a strange, halfway world. Neither peace nor war, just the quiet aftermath of both. Soldiers and civilians mingle awkwardly in the markets. Children stare wide-eyed at the blue uniforms and brass buttons. Street vendors return, selling oysters and sweet potatoes. The sound of hammers echoes through the squares as Union engineers repair docks and warehouses. Life, stubborn as a weed, begins to sprout from the ashes. But not everyone welcomes it. Confederate sympathizers linger in shadows, muttering that Sherman's victory is temporary. One night, a warehouse mysteriously catches fire. Another morning, a sentry is found stabbed near the docks. The general tightens curfews and orders regular patrols. Savannah is not yet tamed, he remarks dryly. You visit the edge of the city one afternoon, where the freedmen's camps stretch into the distance. Children play among the tents, their laughter high and wild. Women cook over smoky fires, men build rough shelters from scrap wood and canvas. The smell of stew and salt fills the air. A Union band plays softly nearby, a tune you don't recognize, something wistful and gentle. You realize it's Home Sweet Home, again, played by men who no longer know what home means. That night, as you walk back through the quiet streets, you pass the great live oaks draped in moss, their branches like arms reaching across the road. The moonlight filters through them, painting the ground in silver shadows. You think of how much has changed since that first night outside Atlanta, how much has been destroyed to reach this uneasy peace. Sherman stands on the balcony again when you return. Below him, the river glows faintly in the moonlight, and somewhere offshore, you can hear the deep horn of a ship. We've shown them, he says softly, not turning. War is the price of their rebellion, but maybe, just maybe, it will teach them the value of peace. His voice falters slightly on the last word, as if he's not sure what it means anymore. Historians will spend generations arguing over him. Visionary or villain, savior or scourge. But in this moment, watching him framed against the stars, you see only a man who looks impossibly tired. The fires of Atlanta and the ashes of Georgia have burned something out of him that victory can't replace. Down on the river, the tide begins to turn, carrying driftwood and debris out toward the sea. It feels like the land itself is exhaling. The march is over, but the memory of it will never stop moving. You close your eyes and let the distant sound of waves wash over the silence. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the world is waiting for dawn, and perhaps, finally, for healing. The calendar reads January 1865. The new year opens on the Georgia coast with a raw wind sweeping in from the Atlantic, carrying both salt and the faint smell of smoke from the hinterlands the army has left behind. Savannah has settled into a peculiar calm. Soldiers wander its tree-lined squares as if in a dream. Merchants reopen their shops under Union protection. Freed people still flock in daily, turning the outskirts into a patchwork city of tents. And above it all, William Tecumseh Sherman paces the veranda of his borrowed headquarters, already restless. He never stays still for long. Even victory, for him, is only an intermission. From this mansion on Bull Street, he begins planning the next act, the march north through the Carolinas. To his officers, he lays it out like a chess game. South Carolina first, because they started this war, and they shall feel it. From there, into North Carolina to link with Grant's armies pressing Lee from Virginia. The Confederacy, already bleeding, will be crushed between the two. The men listen in wary silence. They've just walked 250 miles living on cornmeal and fire. The thought of another campaign through swamps and winter storms draws only a few half-hearted cheers. But they know better than to doubt him now. Sherman's word has the weight of inevitability. Outside, The camps hum with new energy. Regiments refit their uniforms, repair wagons, and receive replacements. Crates of supplies arrive daily from Union ships: flour, beans, barrels of coffee, new boots. For the first time in months, soldiers eat until they're full. Yet, there's an undercurrent of unease. Everyone knows what lies ahead. South Carolina, birthplace of secession, where the war began. The men joke grimly that they'll bring a little of Atlanta's light to Charleston. You stroll through the city streets, where the scars of occupation are fading. Union banners hang beside tattered Confederate ones. The contrast is surreal. Children play in the squares, their laughter echoing off marble statues of long-dead governors. Shops sell trinkets to soldiers: palmetto pins, silver spoons, fragments of burned rail twisted into keepsakes labeled Sherman's neckties, 5 cents apiece. It's strange commerce. War transformed into souvenir. Freedmen still arrive in waves, setting up their settlements beyond the city limits. The new field order number 15 has spread like gospel, promising 40 acres and a mule along the South Carolina and Georgia coast. Surveyors fan out to divide the confiscated plantations. You visit one of the tracts near the Ogeechee River, where families are already clearing fields. They work with borrowed tools, singing hymns that drift over the marshes. Hope clings to them like morning mist. One elderly man tells you, "This here ground, it ours now, by the grace of the Lord and General Sherman." You don't have the heart to tell him how fragile that promise is. In the officers' mess, conversation turns philosophical. Major Howard muses that perhaps this destruction, this hard war, was the only medicine strong enough to cure rebellion. Another replies, "Maybe so, but the cure might kill the patient." The men fall quiet after that. Outside, the rain begins again, drumming on canvas tents. Sherman, for his part, keeps to his maps. At night, candlelight flickers through the tall windows of headquarters as he pores over charts of rivers and roads, plotting routes with straight-edged precision. His staff joke that he measures the world in miles per day. When an aide remarks that the general hasn't smiled since Christmas, Sherman looks up from his desk and says, "Smiles are for peace." We're not there yet. Still, he finds time to write to his family. His letters are oddly tender, full of longing for his children and quiet pride in his soldiers. They have become veterans of endurance, he tells his wife Ellen. No army on earth moves as ours does, self-reliant, steady, and terrible in its purpose. He ends the letter with a single line: "If we can bring this war to its end soon, perhaps the land may forgive us." Forgiveness, however, feels a long way off. As January deepens, reports arrive from upcountry Georgia: bandits, deserters, and desperate civilians raiding one another for food. The Confederacy is collapsing into fragments. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis issues proclamations urging unconquerable resistance, but his words sound hollow. Even some Confederate newspapers admit the truth. Sherman's march has done more than wreck railroads. It has shattered the South's confidence. Yet the North, too, feels uneasy. Newspapers debate whether the general has gone too far. Some ministers call the burning of Georgia a crime against Christian civilization. Others hail it as divine justice. One New York editor writes, "Sherman is not waging war merely on the South. He is waging war on the idea of rebellion itself." Reading the clipping, Sherman shrugs. "Let them debate," he says. "While they talk, we'll act." By the end of the month, orders are issued. The army will march on February 1st. Supplies are loaded, ships readied, routes mapped. Sherman rides out to inspect the troops, his horse splashing through puddles in the narrow streets. The men cheer when they see him, though their voices are hoarse. He removes his hat in reply, a rare gesture of warmth, and says, "We've got one more trip to make, boys. Let's make it count." Before leaving Savannah, he hosts a final council of war. Around the table sit his principal commanders, Howard, Slocum, Logan, Kilpatrick. Rain lashes the windows as they review the plan. Two wings again, marching parallel, converging near Columbia. Destroy every rail, every bridge, every mill that feeds their armies, Sherman says. But remember, we're after rebellion, not revenge. We burn only what sustains the war. The words sound noble, though everyone in the room knows how thin that line will become once the march begins. Later that night, the general walks alone to the riverfront. The tide is low, the ships rocking gently in the dark. Somewhere across the water, frogs croak in the reeds. He looks east, toward the faint glimmer where sea meets sky, and whispers almost to himself, "Goodbye, Savannah." Behind him, the city sleeps under Union occupation, quiet, trembling, uncertain whether to curse or bless the man who spared it. At dawn, bugles echo through the squares. Soldiers form ranks, wagons creak into motion, and once again, the army begins to move. Civilians gather on porches to watch the long blue columns pass down Bay Street. A child waves a handkerchief. A soldier tosses her a piece of hardtack in return. The sound of drums rolls across the cobblestones like thunder fading into distance. By noon, only the hoofprints remain, filling slowly with rainwater. From a hill beyond the city, you turn for one last look. The spires of Savannah shimmer in the morning mist, half veiled, half unreal. Somewhere behind those rooftops lies everything the march has changed. Freedom won and promises broken, ashes and beginnings. Ahead, across the rivers of Carolina, waits the next crucible. Sherman mounts his horse and gives a curt nod. "To Columbia," he says. The columns pivot north, banners snapping in the wind. The swamp ahead looks endless, but no one hesitates. The war moves on, relentless as the tide that brought them here. And as you follow the first ranks into the gray marshland, the smell of salt fades behind you, replaced once again by the familiar scent of pine smoke and mud, the perfume of war itself. In the months that followed the fall of Savannah, history began to gather its dust, and the legend of Sherman's march took root. Newspapers printed it in tones of awe or outrage. Ministers thundered against its cruelty, while Union veterans toasted it as a masterpiece of strategy. But for those who walked its roads, memory was less tidy. You could still feel the rhythm of it in your bones, the tramp of boots, the hiss of burning cotton, the unending murmur of the wind through Georgia's pines. Sherman himself seemed haunted and invigorated all at once. As winter deepened, he rode north into the Carolinas, repeating the same grim calculus of destruction. Columbia would burn, Charleston would fall, and General Johnston's army, his last real opponent, would finally surrender by spring. Yet it was that earlier march through Georgia's heart that defined him. Even his enemies admitted it. The campaign had been a stroke of genius, wrapped in terror. When the war ended, the numbers began to surface. $100 million in damage, 300 miles of track destroyed, hundreds of bridges and depots gone, entire counties stripped bare, millions of pounds of grain, corn, and livestock seized, an empire of cotton undone in a single season. Historians tried to tally it all, but there was no ledger for what the march truly cost, the fear it sowed, the lives upended, the songs that rose from the ashes. And yet, as the years passed, something strange happened. Southerners who once cursed Sherman began to speak of him with reluctant respect. They could hate his methods and still marvel at his results. Even in destruction, he had left a kind of brutal order behind. Railroads would be rebuilt, mills reopened, cities reborn. The South would change, slowly, painfully, but it would change. You think back to those long, muddy roads and realize that the march was never just about geography. It was about breaking the illusion that the Confederacy could endure untouched. Sherman didn't simply capture territory. He shattered the idea of invincibility. War is cruelty, he had said, and you cannot refine it. Historians still debate whether his march marked the birth of total war or merely the perfection of an older, harder truth, that in civil conflict, the line between combatant and bystander is a luxury no army can afford. Even now, scholars argue over definitions. Hard war, psychological warfare, scorched earth. But to the soldiers who lived it, it was simpler. It was hunger and heat and the smell of pine tar. It was rail iron glowing red, smoke drifting over the marshes, and the knowledge that every step took them closer to the sea and farther from who they'd been before. Sherman's own reflections softened with time. In his memoirs, he wrote that he had come to see the march as both terrible and necessary. Since the public mind has settled to the conclusion that the institution of slavery was so interwoven in our system that nothing but the interposition of war could have eradicated it, he confessed. I believe that the war was worth all it cost in life and treasure. It was an admission both proud and weary, the logic of a man who had seen too much to believe in gentler remedies. You picture him years later, gray-haired, standing at reunions beside the very men who once swore to kill him. They shake hands awkwardly, trading stories about roads and rivers, battles and blunders. The bitterness lingers, but so does a shared understanding. They were all part of something too vast for any one of them to claim entirely. The march remains, even now, half myth, half memory. A tale told in firelight and textbooks. Artists paint it as a serpent of smoke winding through Georgia. Poets call it the Long Fire. Tourists trace its route on asphalt highways, reading plaques where chimneys once stood. But the earth remembers more deeply than the signs. Dig into the red clay and you can still find bent rails, bullets, and shards of porcelain from the houses that burned. History, it seems, is never really buried. It just sleeps. And so the story circles back to you, the quiet listener under the soft hum of your room's fan, eyes half closed as the images fade. You've walked those roads in your imagination, the ruined fields, the swamp air thick with smoke, the first salty breeze off the Atlantic. You've felt the exhaustion of men who marched not only through a state, but through the threshold of a new America. Whatever else Sherman's march was, triumph or tragedy, it became the turning of a page. Now, slow your breathing. Picture the last night before Savannah, when the fires had burned low and the soldiers lay scattered across the dark fields. The sky was clear, the stars sharp as nails. Somewhere, a man hummed Home Sweet Home, barely above a whisper. Another stirred the ashes of a dying fire and murmured, "Almost there." The wind carried the smoke eastward, toward the waiting sea. Time moves like that wind, steady, unfeeling, and full of ghosts. But for a moment, here in this quiet, you can let it rest. The march is over. The guns have gone silent. Atlanta's ashes have cooled, and the sea keeps its secrets. All that remains is the soft rhythm of the waves, the echo of distant footsteps fading into sleep. Close your eyes, let the noise of history dim to a heartbeat, and remember what Sherman himself wrote when it was finally done. Peace once more smiles on our land, and maybe, tonight, it smiles on you too.